Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Stars Like Gasoline by Jessika Grewe Glover, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, Celia. I was the only one left at the Vero Beach Museum of Art. A computer tab was open for each file on the email Caesar collection we had acquired the week prior, and I was set about closing each to wind down my workday. The last I hadn't titled, and I sighed aloud, knowing I was going to have to head back to the crates where the collection was stored, awaiting its exhibition at the end of summer. Against the concrete wall at the back of the storage area was the painting I sought. I was normally thorough in my record keeping, so the unnamed piece was a curiosity. Each click of my heels echoed as I moved closer, doing nothing to assuage my anxiety over the oncoming summer storm. Every low-pressure system brought with it unwelcome visitors, oppressive shadows that mimicked my movements and ran nails down my spine. Those who seemed to think the fact that I had what the cisneros side of my family referred to as un pie en el otro lado, or 1 foot on the other side, was an invitation from them to reach out from the beyond. I was 6 years old the day I told my abuela I had met her mother, my long-dead grandmother, the one whose sepia-toned photo was wedged under a thin sheet of glass on my abuela's dresser next to their water-damaged wedding photo, and a lone collection stub from the Catholic Church in Fellsmere. Abuela had turned to me, silver rosary in hand. ¿Es eso la verdad, Celia? She asked me, pulling the Virgin Mary-shaped holy water bottle from behind her perfume. Oscar always called it Abuela's action figure, and Abuelo would scold him, then chuckle, whispering that he too thought the shape of the bottle was bizarre. Sí, Abuela, I answered her, fiddling with the floral bedspread. Una bruja, a witch, to some. To my family, it was simply who I was. Just as much a part of me as my dark hair or strong legs, my strange husky voice, and my love of art, which ran deep enough that I made it into my career. Flipping on an additional light in the back room of the museum, I moved to the Caesar painting, trying to get a better look at the brushed seascape. My phone buzzed from the pocket of my slacks, but I didn't bother to check it, as I knew it was my brother Oscar, wondering why I was late for dinner at our mom's house. Oscar was the reason I made the move back home to Vero Beach from Boston after the death of Nate, my brother's fiancé. We spoke daily while I lived away, and after Nate's death, I could hear in his voice that there were more bad days than good. When Nate's mother's beachside bungalow went on the market, I jumped at the opportunity to make the move home and into the house of my brother's dead fiancé's mother. When it buzzed again, I shot him a text saying they should eat without me, as I'd been held up at work, and then squatted down to inspect the art. As soon as my rear end touched my heels, the lights in the room flickered. I started at the strobe effect and put a hand to my pocket as though the technology within were a talisman. A pregnant pause in the room's atmosphere kicked off a waltz of uneven beats in my chest. I stood to walk out, happy at that point to close the file, sans name, when the room fell black. In my peripheral vision stood a shadow, somehow darker than the room itself. It vibrated with the rumble of thunder from beyond the museum walls. Abuela had always warned me to never look apparitions in the eye. Move slow, mija, and treat them like perros caleros, rabid dogs. With my first footfall, frigid hands shoved me from behind. I ran for the door, squealing like a pig in slaughter when it slammed into my face. After fumbling for the handle, I pulled it open and took off at a race-worthy sprint, calling my brother as I fled. A dim light shone on the chandelier in the foyer of the museum, giving me a stroke of hope to make it outside. A security guard stood on the front steps talking to a man who looked about my age. Once outside and in company, I heaved a breath and realized I couldn't tell them what had happened. No one would believe me. Oscar was still yelling into my phone, which I clutched to my ear. The guard kept asking what happened and should he call the cops. I shook my head, saying I was spooked, and the other man smiled at me, pushing a fall of hair from his forehead. I laughed, pretending to go along with the girl afraid of the dark charade. Both men offered to escort me back to my office and fetch my handbag, an offer which I admit I accepted. I'm Jacob Wentworth, that man offered. He held out his hand as we walked the length of the museum. Jacob had the sort of blue eyes that looked haunted and perpetually on the verge of tears, which I was quite sure worked to his advantage. Celia Sullivan, I introduced myself and took his hand. The new curator. I heard mention of you. My dad is on the board here. I nodded, checking my phone for the time. I'd missed dinner. Again. I really did feel bad. I made it out to Tia's house in Fellsmere more than I saw my mom, who lived 5 minutes from me. So you've overseen the Emile Caesar collection here. All sorts of mystery surrounding that one, huh? Jacob asked. I thought for a second before I answered, my heart still on a treadmill. A bit of a mystery, I guess, only in the anonymity of the benefactor, I said as I switched off the lights and grabbed my things. Once I had my bag in hand and the workday officially behind me, I heard Jacob starting to ask if he could take me for a drink, his slight southern accent turning the I in drink to an A. I was opening my mouth to answer when my brother pulled up to the front of the museum. Oscar waggled his eyebrows at me, moving the raised scar on his cheek. I'd love to get a look at the collection sometime, if for no other reason than to tell my dad I met you. Jacob winked at me with those Caribbean blue eyes. Security made certain I was fine before calling this Wentworth character over toward the sculpture garden. I thanked Jacob, deliberately pretending I didn't hear his offer for a drink, and left. Oscar followed me home in the rain, though I insisted I was fine. I raced to my door and waved to him through the storm from under the bougainvillea's curtained overhang at my porch. Power was out completely across my neighborhood. I stripped out of my wet clothes and put on some cozy shorts and a sweatshirt before retreating to my bedroom with a glass of Cabernet and a book. It was only 6 p.m, but the house was dark. The curtains allowed enough light in for me to read, while corners of the room remained swathed in darkness. Soft shadows danced on the freshly painted white walls. Reflections of rain dotted the paint, pouncing from the mirror. Darker pockets moved in, the suspension of breath between lightning flash and thunder. I looked up, but saw nothing, and jumped when the thunder came. All day I'd been twitchy, just waiting for the building weather to manifest into something other. As frightening as the occurrence in the museum had been, this storm felt like that had been just the beginning. Seeing Oscar had texted me, I opened my phone. The room turned from night to day in the space of the next flash, and a scarf-like trail of deep black drifted toward the bed. A sick sort of transfixed paralysis held me in place, staring at the trail. It spread wider, like smoke released from a chimney. My feet pulled higher on the bed in an instinctive retreat from the sludge. Though its initial appearance was shapeless, the longer I watched it, the more it formed. Within the next flash of lightning, inky hands reached for me. I flung myself from the mattress out the door into the living room. I hadn't had the time to finish remodeling the living and dining rooms yet, so tools, paint, boxes, and sheets covered the entirety. Shades drawn, it was fully dark. My bare foot caught a drill left on the ground, and I stumbled into the couch with a curse. Lightning flashed, and I swallowed. A void of brightness spilled from the hall into the living room. I backed myself into a corner and wanted to slap myself. Stupid, stupid girl. I called Oscar, watching the void move toward me. There's something here, I said, just above a whisper. Help me. Darkness moved closer, hovering a couple feet away. I banked right and threw myself at the door, feeling cold fingers touch my feet. Outside was mercifully absent of that void, but I stood in the middle of the street, looking at my house, the rain matting my hair and clothes for the second time in an hour. Within minutes, there were police cars coming from both ends of the street, my brother's car trailing them. Closing my eyes, I shook my head. Oscar ran to me along with the officers. I gave them permission to look in the house, though I knew there was nothing there, nothing they would be able to find anyway. I felt like a tool. Knowing my face was about 20 shades of red, I took a deep breath and looked at my brother. He stood next to an officer, each holding an umbrella over my head, yet somehow the rain was sliding between the two directly onto me. Celia? Oscar asked. I met his eyes. I couldn't tell him what happened in front of the officer, so I glossed over the truth and felt like a criminal. The story I gave the officer was a mishmash of what I did when I got home. When it came to the part with the shadows attacking me, I gave a cursory explanation. There was a noise, I said, thinking really it was a lack of noise, and movement in the house. I don't know how else to describe it. I wasn't alone, and there were shadows and noises, and I sound like I'm telling you there were monsters under my bed, don't I? To his credit, the officer smiled warmly but didn't laugh. If they are under your bed, then we will find them. Could it have been someone lurking outside? Maybe you saw shadows on the window. Not to discredit you, he amended, cheeks turning pink. It's just as sketchy if something had been outside your window in this weather. It hadn't occurred to me until he said it that the lightning had stopped. He sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place him. I'd probably dealt with him on the phone before. We'd had to call the cops on a bunch of drunkards who loiter in the museum lot after dark. Want me to keep someone outside tonight? It's not, couldn't you? Oscar asked the officer. I could, he answered carefully, dark eyes narrowed at my brother. I told them it wasn't necessary, though in my head I was downright terrified to go back inside alone. Oscar asked him again. Oscar, come on, it's no big deal. I'm sure this officer, Kikumoto, he said, Sergeant Kikumoto. He's a sergeant, Oz. He doesn't need to be on babysitting duty. You could stay with me. Oh, I will. Adrian, he turned to the sergeant. Ah, he knew him. I looked at Sergeant Kikumoto now, tall. I wasn't terribly tall, but he towered over both Oscar and me. 6 foot, maybe taller. Dark straight hair, tanned in a way that told me his skin was a divine gift of genetics in the Sunshine State. He looked at us with nearly black almond-shaped eyes, sighed, and agreed before leaving to speak to other officers. Oscar then bombarded me with questions. I told him what happened, and he paled. I didn't make it up, Oz, and I had maybe a sip of wine at that point. Honestly, something was in there. Twice today, I've been bothered by one of them. Growing up, spending half our time with the Mexican side of our family out in Fellsmere, we heard all the old tales of spirits and restless dead from our abuela and tia. Never had I felt uncomfortable in my own place. As a child, I knew when spirits were around. Oscar, too. The parts of me I kept under wraps with the Sullivan side of the family were given a warm welcome by the Cisneros side. None of my family in Fellsmere batted an eye when I acknowledged a passing specter during dinner time or shut the bathroom door harder than necessary and yelled, "Mind your own business," to dead air. Those were all harmless entities. Every once in a while, I crossed paths with one who wasn't simply curious. Every once in a while, my skin pricked in warning. Every hair on my arm stood on end as I told Oscar what had happened. In all the encounters I'd had in the past, I never quite felt how I did just moments ago. What I felt deep in the part of me was that recognized the Song of the Dead was that the one in my house this evening was what Abuela warned me about. Malevolence and spite. Every nook, cranny, and corner of the house was checked. Once the officers left, Oscar and I smudged it, put holy water out, even pulled out our Tia Teresita's rosary that I kept tucked away. We must have looked a sight dancing around the bungalow with bundles of sage and Palo Santo smoking from our hands, not to mention the blue and white Virgin Mary bottle of holy water, which I splashed like it was gasoline, and I was covering up crying. It was properly evening by the time we crawled under the covers. I hadn't made up a guest room, so Oscar bunked in with me for the night. My eyes couldn't stay away from the corner where I'd first noticed the shadow. Though the room was clear and calm now, my nerves were still at level 10. Oscar fell asleep instantly. He always could nod off when and where he wanted. I, on the other hand, lay awake for hours watching the time tick by. Around 2, I got up and walked to the kitchen. Sleeping was useless, so coffee was made. Percolating sounds bubbled merrily from the pot. With the air conditioner cranked up inside, the windows were fogged over from the humidity outside. Soft knocking sounded at the front door, and I nearly peed myself. Sergeant Kikumoto stood on the other side. I saw the light come on and stay on, and I wanted to check in, he said. Sorry to disturb you. Couldn't sleep. I'm making coffee if you'd like some. I slapped at a mosquito on my exposed leg. That was why I had moved away. The damned bugs. I also noticed I was barely dressed, wearing only short sleep shorts and a cami. He said he'd love a cup and followed me through the house. Kikumoto, I said abruptly as we sat at the kitchen counter. He nodded. Japanese? Obviously. God, Celia. My grandparents. That far back. Most people assume I'm Cuban here in Florida. Do you know of the artist Taiko Kikumoto? He shook his head no. Your name means Book of Chrysanthemums. I'm sure you know that. Taiko Kikumoto used to hide a small chrysanthemum or a book in his paintings. You could find the series or year he painted it based on which he hid. In later years, it was both. I've always liked working with his stuff. What did he paint? Sergeant Kikumoto sipped from his black coffee. Lots of water, I laughed. Oceans, rivers, waterfalls. There's always water with levels of hidden quirks. It's never just a landscape. Social commentary, political thumb-biting, sexual references. He had a little sub-themes to each painting. The sergeant was quiet for a long stretch of time. I poured more coffee and pulled my hair into a ponytail. I'll have to look him up. I don't know much about art. Took art history in college, but nothing beyond that. I've never even been to the museum here. Where you work? He smiled, and I thought he was quite handsome. And it wasn't just the uniform. He and Oscar would look good together. Come to the museum when I'm working. I'll show you around, I told him. As thanks. I'd like that. Can you tell me what really happened here tonight? The cup slipped from my hands and clattered to the counter. I grabbed a tea towel and mopped up the mess. There was obviously no way I would tell him what happened. Oscar ran in, looking like a wild dog with his hair in a mad tangle, t-shirt askew. When he saw us in the kitchen, he blew out a breath and slumped into the counter stool. I'd vacated. In the low kitchen lighting, my brother's scar was more pronounced, his face showing a hint of violence in his past. The events he had lived through that dimmed his smile for a time. Losing Nate dimmed it again, but I was seeing it brighten day by day since I'd moved back home. My gaze moved from my brother to the officer in my kitchen. The sergeant didn't ask me again what had occurred, but I felt him sizing me up. Good God Almighty, he had that stare into your soul way about him. Adrian, would you reach the coffee for me? My brother yawned, rubbing where his eyes met the raised tissue of his cheek. Okay, so you two, rather than ask, I left it open for them to explain. I didn't think Oscar had been with anyone since Nate's death over a year ago, but I also didn't pry. We? The sergeant asked. Oh, no, we aren't. Adrian and Nate were best friends, Oscar said, stifling another yawn. Christ, what ungodly hour is it? We were in the Navy together, found out we were both from here. I did my tour, got out, have been a cop ever since. Nate went career. I felt once again like I'd missed so much living away from my brother for so many years. I need to get home, guys. There should be another unit outside. Are you off duty? I asked him. I was off when I knocked on your door. Was about to head out when I saw your light on. Thanks for the coffee. Here's my card. He took a gold pen from his breast pocket and wrote on the card. Oscar has my number, but you should have it too. Call if you need anything.